In this video we will explore the invasion of Poland during the beginning of the First World War. Now sit back, relax and enjoy the story. The world does not end with a shout. It ends with birdsong. That is the first thing Tomasz Wisniewski remembered afterward, not the thunder, not the smoke, not the sound that came later and never quite left him, but the birds. A pair of yellowhammers somewhere in the older trees along the river bank, trading their thin, reedy calls back and forth in the blue dark before sunrise, as if the morning were ordinary. As if the morning was simply a morning. He was 23 years old. He had brown eyes and his mother's wide forehead, and a small scar along his left jaw where a scythe had caught him at 14 during the harvest at his uncle's farm near Lodz. He was not a tall man, but he was solid, the kind of solid that comes from years of lifting and carrying and walking, not from any particular ambition toward strength. His hands were a farmer's hands, broad and patient. They looked, he had always thought, like his father's hands. He had not yet decided whether that was a comfort or a warning. He sat with his back against the earthen wall of the trench and looked up at the sky. It was still the purple gray of not quite dawn, that uncertain hour when the stars have faded but the sun has not yet committed to rising. The water river was somewhere below him in the mist. He could hear it, a soft persistent murmuring over the stones, indifferent and steady and very old. The smell of the water reached him even here, that particular river smell of cold mud and waterweed and distance. The smell of somewhere else. Somewhere moving. Beside him, Corporal Joseph Dabrowski was sleeping. This was, Tomasz had come to understand over the past 3 weeks of waiting, simply what Joseph did. The man could sleep anywhere, in any position, under any conditions. He was sleeping now with his helmet tilted over his eyes and his rifle across his knees and his mouth slightly open, breathing with the slow, luxurious depth of a man in a feather bed rather than a man in a hole in the earth on the western edge of Poland on the first day of September, 1939. A small grasshopper had landed on his shoulder. Joseph did not notice. Tomasz watched the grasshopper for a moment, then looked away. He reached into the front pocket of his tunic and took out the letter. He had read it so many times that he no longer needed to unfold it fully. He knew the crease of it, the slight softening of the paper where his thumb had worn it, the way his sister Marta's handwriting grew smaller and more hurried toward the bottom of the page as though she had been running out of time. He held it without reading it. He just held it. The yellowhammers called again. He thought about the farm. He thought about the particular quality of late summer mornings there, the way the light came horizontal and golden through the linden trees, the way the dew lay heavy on the barley, each stalk bowed slightly as if in thought. He thought about the smell of bread from the kitchen window. He thought about the dog, old Burris, grey-muzzled and slow, who would lie across the doorstep in the sun with such complete and absolute contentment that as a boy Tomasz had sometimes lain down beside him just to understand what that felt like. He could almost feel the warmth of the stones beneath him, the heaviness of the dog's side, rising and falling. "You're not sleeping." The voice came from his right. Private Henryk Meza, barely 19, was sitting with his knees drawn up and his eyes open, staring at the lightening sky. He was from Poznan. He had been to university for 1 year before his conscription, and occasionally, when he was tired or frightened, Latin phrases surfaced in his conversation without warning, which the other men found either impressive or unsettling depending on their mood. "No," Tomasz said. "I tried," Henryk said. "I couldn't." "You'll sleep later." Henryk looked at him. There was something in the young man's face, not quite fear, but the near neighbor of it, the thing that lives in the same house as fear and shares its bread. His eyes were very clear and very awake. "Do you think it's today?" he said quietly. Tomasz folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "I think it might be today," he said. Henryk nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already decided for himself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My Professor Lewandowski, in medieval history he used to say that the most important skill a person could learn was how to wait. He said the whole of the Middle Ages was really just practice in waiting." He paused. "I always thought he was being eccentric." "And now?" Henrik looked out over the top of the trench toward the grey-green line of the far bank. Now I think he might have been the wisest man I ever met. Tomasz almost smiled. The river murmured on below them. The position they held was along a gentle bend in the water, west of the town of Czestochowa, where the valley widened and the far bank rose in a low ridge of mixed forest birch and pine and patches of older oak that had been, 3 weeks ago, simply beautiful and is now something else entirely. Something that must be watched. Something that watches back. Their platoon was part of the 7th Infantry Division, Army Lodz, and they had been in this stretch of earthworks since the middle of August, digging and waiting and listening to the radio reports and the conversations of officers and the rumors that traveled through an army the way water travels through soil slowly, by capillary, arriving changed and dark. The rumors had been consistent in one direction if nothing else. The Germans were coming. The Germans were massing. The Germans had 50 divisions. 100 divisions. The Germans had machines they had never seen before. Tomasz had no strong opinion about machines. He had strong opinions about the river. He had waded into it twice, once by accident when the rope ferry got away from him, once deliberately just to feel something cold and clean, and he knew its current, knew the way it ran shallow over a gravel bar 50 meters north and deep and treacherous at the bend. He knew where a man could cross and where a man could not. This knowledge felt, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, like something. At 5:23 in the morning, the silence ended. It did not end all at once. It ended the way a dream ends gradually, with a sound at the edge of consciousness that you first fold into the dream and then cannot. A low vibration, a trembling in the earth, almost beneath hearing. Tomasz felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard it, a deep subsonic shudder as though something very large had turned over in its sleep far to the west. Then the sound arrived. It was nothing like what he had imagined. He had expected something sharp, something sudden, a crack, a bang, the clean percussive sound of a film or a story. What he heard instead was something vast and continuous, a rolling, layered thunder without beginning or end, as though the whole western horizon had decided to speak. It was the sound of artillery. Hundreds of guns. Perhaps thousands. He would not know the number until much later, and even then the number would not mean anything to him, because numbers cannot hold that sound. Beside him, Joseph woke up. He woke up completely, in one motion, helmet straight, rifle ready, eyes clear the way soldiers wake up, without the fuzzy margins of civilian sleep. He looked at Tomasz. "Ah," he said. Just that. "Ah." As though something he had suspected had been confirmed. Along the trench, men were rising. Tomasz could hear them, the shuffle and clink of equipment, the low urgent murmurs, someone's voice cut short by a superior, the particular silence that falls when men stop pretending. Lieutenant Novak appeared at the bend of the trench, moving at a half-crouch, his face composed in that careful, deliberate way that officers practice so that the men beneath them will have something to organize their own fear around. "Stand to," he said quietly. "Stand to, everyone. Remain in position." The words were calm. The artillery, in the west, continued its conversation with the sky. Tomasz picked up his rifle. It was a Mauser WZ-29, and it had been his for 3 weeks, and he still did not quite think of it as his in the way he thought of his boots or his watch as his. It was more like something borrowed from a future he hadn't entirely agreed to inhabit. He checked the bolt. He looked over the parapet at the far bank. The mist was lifting. The river glittered in the first grey light. The yellow hammers had stopped singing. Henrik was beside him now, shoulder to shoulder, and Tomasz could feel the slight tremor in the young man, not cowardice, nothing so simple, just the body doing what bodies do when the blood runs fast and old, when something older than thought runs up the spine and makes the hands want to move. Tomasz had the same tremor. He suspected Joseph had it too, underneath the stillness. "Dum spiro, spio," Henrik said quietly. "What does that mean?" Tomasz asked. "While I breathe, I hope." Tomasz considered this. The artillery in the west rose in pitch slightly, the way a storm rises as it approaches, not louder so much as closer, more specific, as though it were beginning to have opinions about particular geography.
"Good," he said.
"Keep breathing."
He settled his elbows on the lip of the trench.
The river ran on below them, patient and indifferent and old. The light continued to come. The birch trees on the far bank emerged from the mist one by one, white-barked and still, standing in the waterlight like witnesses to something they did not cause and cannot stop.
Tomasz thought about his dog. He thought about the warmth of stones. He breathed. The mist did not burn off all at once.
It retreated slowly, the way reluctant things retreat by degrees, pulling back from the river's surface in long, trailing wisps, as though the water were releasing something it had held through the night and was not entirely certain it was ready to let go. The far bank emerged gradually from this dissolving grey, first the pale columns of the birch trees, then the darker mass of the pines behind them, then slowly, reluctantly the ridge itself, rising above the tree line in the early light like a thought becoming clear.
Tomasz watched it the way you watch something you are not sure you want to see. The artillery was still speaking in the west. It had not stopped.
It had tried to count, to make it manageable, to give it the ordinary shape of minutes, perhaps 40 minutes now. Perhaps more. Time had developed a peculiar quality since the sound began, a stretchiness, an unwillingness to move at its usual pace, as though it too were listening.
He had heard that this happened.
An old man in his village, a veteran of the last war, had told him once that in battle time behaves like a drunk man. Sometimes it sprints, sometimes it sits down in the road and refuses to move at all, and you cannot predict which it will do next.
He was beginning to understand what the old man meant. Beside him, Joseph was eating. This too was simply what Joseph did.
He had produced, from somewhere in the depths of his pack, a piece of dark bread and a small fold of wax paper containing 3 slices of kielbasa, and he was eating them with the same unhurried methodical attention he brought to everything, chewing slowly, looking out over the parapet, occasionally brushing crumbs from his tunic with the back of his hand.
He had offered some to Tomasz. Tomasz had declined.
His stomach was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with hunger. "You should eat," Joseph said, not looking at him. "Later." "There may not be a later that is better suited to eating than this later." "That's a terrible sentence."
"I was a carpenter," Joseph said mildly.
"Not a poet."
He was from a small town near Krakow.
He was 31 years old, which made him the oldest man in their section and gave him, in the eyes of the younger soldiers, a quality that approached wisdom even when it was simply stubbornness. He had a wife and a daughter of 4 years old whose name was Zosha, and he kept a photograph of them in the band of his helmet, tucked between the leather and the steel, so that it curved slightly against the interior of the dome, and the 2 faces looked up at the inside of the helmet rather than out at the world.
Tomasz had asked him once why he kept it there rather than in his pocket. "Because then it is always with me," Joseph had said, "even when I am not thinking about it." Now Tomasz looked along the line of the trench.
15 men visible from here, more beyond the bend. Boys and men and the few in between, all arranged along the earthen wall with their rifles and their particular private expressions. Young Henrik, to his right, had his jaw set in a way that was clearly meant to look determined and instead looked like a boy who has decided to be determined and is finding it harder than expected. Further along, Private Staszek Nowicki, broad-shouldered, 25, a butcher's son from Warsaw who laughed loudly and often and had not laughed once this morning, was running his thumb along the sight of his rifle in a slow repetitive motion, back and forth, the way you rub a worry stone. The things men do with their hands when there is nothing yet for their hands to do. Lieutenant Novak appeared again, moving along the trench with that same careful, composed expression.
He stopped beside Tomasz and looked out at the far bank.
"Movement reported 2 kilometers north," he said quietly, not quite to Tomasz, not quite to anyone. "They've crossed at Kalanawo."
Tomasz absorbed this.
"How many?"
Joseph asked, still chewing.
"Enough."
The lieutenant paused.
He was young for a lieutenant, perhaps 27, 28 with light eyes and a narrow face and the kind of precise, clipped manner that either came from good breeding or was meant to suggest it. But this morning there was something underneath the precision, something that surfaced briefly when he looked at the far bank, that Tomasz recognized as exactly the same thing he felt himself. Hold position. Wait for the signal. Do not fire until you have something worth firing at.
He moved on down the line. Something worth firing at.
Tomasz had tried, over the past weeks, to make himself understand what that would mean. He had hunted since boyhood hare, duck, once a roe deer with his uncle in the autumn forests above Lodz, and he understood the mechanics of the thing, the patience and the stillness and the breath held slow, the particular clarity that comes in the moment before.
But this was different. He knew it was different.
He had known it in the abstract for weeks, and he was beginning to know it in some less abstract way this morning, with the artillery still rolling in the west and the mist still lifting from the river and the far bank emerging moment by moment into the grey September light.
He made himself think about the river instead.
The gravel bar, 50 meters north, where the water ran shallow and fast over pale stones. A man could cross there in water to his thighs, moving carefully, but he would be exposed for 50, 60 meters, an eternity of exposure in the open water, nothing between him and the opposite bank but 30 centimeters of river.
This was why they were positioned here.
This was what they were here to make costly. He had never thought, before this summer, about the military value of a river, about the way water becomes an argument, about the way a thing that is simply beautiful on a Sunday afternoon in peacetime becomes something you calculate, something you measure with different eyes.
He had swum in the water as a child, visiting cousins near Unijau.
He remembered the cold shock of it, the green murk beneath the surface, the way the current pulled at you gently and persistently like something that wanted to explain something. Now he looked at it and thought, range,
cover,
angle of fire.
He was not entirely sure when this had happened to him. He was not entirely sure he approved of it.
Then Henrik said, there.
His voice was very quiet, almost a whisper.
But everyone in earshot heard it, because everyone in earshot had been waiting for it, and the word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water.
Tomasz looked. At first he saw nothing.
The far bank, the birch trees, the dark mass of the pines, the ridge.
Ordinary.
Then his eyes found the movement, and once they found it they could not unfind it. The way it works with those pictures that hide a shape inside the pattern, and once you have seen the shape you cannot look at the picture again without seeing it. There were men in the trees.
Not many. Not yet.
Just shapes dark, careful, moving through the birches with a particular kind of deliberateness that he recognized immediately and wordlessly as the movement of men who are trying not to be seen. They moved between the trunks with short, low rushes, pausing, scanning, moving again.
They were too far away to see their faces.
Too far away to see the details of their uniforms, though the shape of the helmets, that particular silhouette, broader and lower than his own, was clear enough in the growing light.
The Germans. There they were.
The word everyone had been using for 3 weeks, the abstraction, the thing in the radio reports and the officers' conversations and the rumors, and here it was made suddenly, completely concrete. Men, moving through birch trees, in the grey morning light on the other side of a river.
He felt something strange. Not what he had expected.
What he had expected, what the stories and the films and the old man in the village had led him to expect, something dramatic. Anger, perhaps, or fear, or the hot surge of something he could not name. What he felt instead was simpler and stranger than any of that. A kind of radical clarity. A stepping into focus. As though everything up until this moment had been slightly soft at the edges and had now, all at once, become sharp.
He noticed that his hands had stopped trembling.
Hold. Lieutenant Novak's voice came from somewhere down the trench.
Steady. Clear.
Hold position. No one moved.
The figures in the trees multiplied.
5, now, that he could count.
Then 8.
Then more than he could easily count, spreading along the tree line, finding their own positions.
Some had reached the water's edge.
He could see one crouching behind the roots of a fallen birch, half in the water, looking across at the Polish bank with the same patient, watchful stillness with which Tomasz was looking back.
He thought, that man is about my age. He did not know why this occurred to him. He did not particularly want it to.
But it had the quality of a fact that insists on itself regardless of convenience, and he could not make it go away, and so he let it sit there in the back of his mind alongside the count of figures and the depth of the river and the distance to the gravel bar.
That man is about my age. That man has hands. That man, this morning, looked at the same sky.
Joseph, very quietly, finished the last of his kielbasa and folded the wax paper and put it back in his pack with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Well, he said, under his breath, to no one in particular.
The river ran between them.
25 meters of cold September water, murmuring over its stones, doing what rivers do, carrying its old indifferent message down toward the sea.
Staszek had stopped rubbing the sight of his rifle. His thumb was still.
Henrik was breathing very carefully beside Tomasz, the deliberate, controlled breathing of a young man who has decided that this is something he can control and is controlling it with everything he has.
Dum spiro, spio.
While I breathe, I hope. Tomasz settled his cheek against the stock of his rifle. The man behind the fallen birch had not moved. The morning came on, grey and ordinary, smelling of river water and pine resin and the distant, acrid something that rode the wind from the west.
They waited.
The birds, very far away now, began to find their voices again tentatively, one at a time, as though testing whether the world would permit it.
A single crow somewhere above the tree line. Then silence.
Then, improbably, impossibly, the thin whistling phrase of a blackbird, clear as water over stone.
Tomasz listened to it for the 3 seconds it lasted.
Then the whistle blew, and the river erupted, and the morning became something else entirely. Later, when he tried to remember it clearly, he could not.
This surprised him.
He had assumed that the first time would be the most vivid, that it would imprint itself with the hard, precise clarity of something significant, the way a wedding stays with you, or the moment you hear of a death, or the morning a child is born. He had assumed he would be able to close his eyes afterward and see it frame by frame, like a series of photographs, each one sharp and accountable.
Instead there were fragments.
Sound, first and overwhelming, a sound so large and so sudden that it seemed less like something he heard and more like something that happened to the air around him, a general concussion that the body received rather than the ears, that traveled up through the soles of his boots and into his chest and sat there, heavy and ringing, for a long time after.
The sound
of his own rifle, which he had fired, which he would not remember firing. The sound of the rifles along the trench, a ragged, rolling series, individual shots blurring into something continuous.
The sound of the water.
The sound of a man, somewhere, calling out in which language he could not tell and would not know. Then a fragment of vision. The far bank, suddenly obscured by smoke. White smoke first, then grey, drifting across the surface of the river in long horizontal sheets, so that the birch trees appeared and disappeared through it like things glimpsed through a curtain.
The fallen log.
The figures, some still, some no longer visible, some.
He did not finish that thought.
Then Joseph's hand on his shoulder, pressing him down below the parapet as something passed overhead with a sound like tearing fabric, close enough that he felt it rather than heard it, a displacement of air that was somehow personal, that seemed to have opinions about the specific space his head had just occupied. He pressed himself against the earthen wall and breathed.
The wall was cool against his back.
He could feel individual stones in it, rounded river stones mixed into the soil, pressing through his tunic.
He focused on the stones. He counted the pressure of them.
1, at his left shoulder blade.
2, at the small of his back.
1, larger, uncomfortable, beneath his right hip.
This is real, he thought. This is here. These are stones.
Reload, Joseph said, beside him.
Tomasz looked at his hands.
They were already doing it, already moving through the sequence without consultation from any conscious part of him, thumbing cartridges from the stripper clip with a steadiness that surprised him. His hands, it turned out, had paid better attention than the rest of him.
"I know," he said. "Good."
From further down the trench, Lieutenant Novak's voice, still carrying that careful composure, fraying only slightly at the edges now. "Maintain position.
Keep low."
Second section, cover the north. They'll probe the bar.
The gravel bar. Tomasz had known it would be the gravel bar.
He came up to the parapet again, slowly, leading with his helmet, keeping his profile small. They had drilled this, had been told about this, and he found now with a cold relief that the drilling had gone somewhere that did not entirely depend on the cooperation of his conscious mind.
He found the far bank through the smoke.
The shapes in the trees had pulled back from the water's edge, most of them. One had not, or could not, a figure in the shallows, very still, face down in the water with one arm extended as though reaching for something on the far bank. He looked away. North, along the curve of the bank, he could hear the faster, tighter exchange of fire that meant the gravel bar.
He could not see it from here.
He could hear Noiki, further down the trench, calling out something sharp and short, and he could hear the response affirmative, steady, and he held on to the sound of those voices the way you hold onto a rope in dark water.
Henrik was beside him.
The young man was firing with a controlled, deliberate pace that was far steadier than Tomasz had expected, working the bolt between shots with a smooth economy of motion, his face pressed to the stock and his eyes narrowed and his jaw still set in that effortful determination that had become, in the past few minutes, something slightly less effortful and slightly more real. He was doing it because his body had been taught to do it, and his body was doing it, and he was, somewhere inside that, doing it too. Bars holding. Stashek called from their right, relaying from some signal further down the line.
Tomasz exhaled.
The exchange lasted, he thought, perhaps 12 minutes. Perhaps 15.
Perhaps 5.
Time was behaving as the old man had warned. But at some point, by degrees, the fire from the far bank diminished.
Then thinned.
Then stopped, except for occasional probing shots that came without pattern from deep in the tree line, a question rather than an argument, asking if anyone was still paying attention.
They were still paying attention.
And then, with the slow, uncertain quality of something that is not quite over but has paused to consider itself, a silence descended on the river. Not the silence of before, not that clean, bird-song silence, that yellowhammer silence full of the possibility of ordinary morning.
A different silence.
A silence that had been in the presence of noise and retained the shape of it, the way a room retains the smell of smoke after the fire has gone out. A silence that knew more than it had an hour ago.
Tomasz sat back against the wall. His ears were ringing.
There was a high, thin note that lived behind all other sounds now, behind the river, behind the distant artillery, behind the voices of the men around him beginning, carefully, tentatively, to speak again.
He thought it might go away. He thought it might not. He looked at his hands.
The steadiness that had seen him through the firing had left them now. They were shaking slightly, not violently, not dramatically, just a fine, persistent tremor, as though something in him had been wound too tight and was now, slowly, unwinding. He pressed them flat against his thighs and felt the tremor pass through his palms into his legs and dissipate.
He looked at Henrik.
The young man was sitting with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees and his eyes open and his face very pale beneath the shadow of his helmet.
He was breathing.
He was breathing with that same deliberate care, in and out, slow and counted, and his lips were moving slightly though he was not making any sound that Tomasz could hear.
Tomasz reached over and put his hand briefly on the young man's arm. Henrik looked at him.
"You're all right," Tomasz said. It was not a question, exactly, and not entirely a statement. It was something in between, something that inhabited the space between what was true and what needed to be said for the next hour to be possible.
Henrik seemed to understand this.
"Yes," he said. Then, after a moment, "Dumb Spyro."
"Spio," Tomasz said. They sat with that for a while. Joseph, inevitably, was checking his ammunition. He was doing it with the focused, inventory-minded expression of a man assessing the contents of his workshop after an unexpected job, methodical, unsurprised, already calculating what would be needed next. He caught Tomash's eye and gave a small nod that communicated, with the efficiency of a man who does not use more words than necessary, something like, "That was the first part. There will be more parts. We are still here." Tomash nodded back. Lieutenant Novak came along the trench. His composure was more intact, Tomash thought, than it had any right to be, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with just slightly more care than before, that said he was managing it and knew he was managing it. He stopped at each man. He looked at each man's face with a directness that was not performance, that said, "I am counting you. I am accounting for you. You matter in this count." He arrived at Tomash. "Casualties?" Tomash asked. A pause. "Not long." "Mykolai," the lieutenant said quietly. "North section." Tomash closed his eyes for a moment. Mykolai Kuzmichak, 20 years old, from a village near Kielce, who had a habit of humming to himself when he was nervous and had consequently been humming almost continuously since they arrived at this position 3 weeks ago, who had shown Tomash, last week, a terrible drawing he had made of the river at sunset, terrible in the technical sense, earnest in every other sense, and asked him with great seriousness whether he thought it captured the light. He had told him yes. "Anyone else?" he made himself ask. "Pulowski has a crease along the arm. He'll keep." Novak looked out at the river. "They'll come again. The morning report says crossings north and south of us. They are establishing a line." He paused. "We hold until we receive orders otherwise." He moved on. Tomash sat very still for a moment. Then he reached into his tunic and took out his sister's letter. He did not unfold it. He simply held it in his palm and felt the weight of it, which was almost no weight at all, which was lighter than anything that should be carried that much in it. Her handwriting on the fold. The address she had sent it to 7th Infantry Division, Army Lodz, care of Field Post, in the slightly careful script she used when she was writing formally, which was the script she always used for anything that mattered to her. He thought about her at the kitchen table. The lamp. The particular small sound of her pen on the paper. He put the letter away. The river ran on. The smoke was clearing now, drifting east, thinning against the pale sky until it was nothing, until the far bank was visible again, the birch trees standing exactly as they had before, white-barked and patient, leaves beginning to show the first faint yellow of the turning season. A smear of September color, the most ordinary thing in the world. The artillery in the west had not stopped. It had not stopped for a single moment. Tomash leaned his head back against the earthen wall and looked up at the sky. It had gone from purple-gray to a thin, washed blue, the kind of blue that holds no warmth yet, that promises warmth the way a cold room promises warmth when you light the stove eventually, with patience, if you wait long enough. He was very tired. He had not slept, and now all the hours of not sleeping had arrived at once and were sitting on him with a combined weight that was considerable. He was 23 years old, and the world had changed this morning, and the change was not finished, and somewhere to the north, across a gravel bar in the shallow bend of the water, men had tried to cross a river and had been stopped and would try again. And somewhere west of everything a machine was running that he had no name adequate for. And Mykolai Kuzmichak, who could not draw, would not finish the drawing. He breathed. The blackbird, impossibly, improbably, was singing again. Somewhere in the alders downstream, out of sight, making its bright liquid declaration to the September morning as though it had weighed everything and decided that it was still, on balance, worth singing about. Tomash listened to it. He listened to it until it stopped, and then he listened to the river, and then, very quietly, eyes still open, watching the slow morning move across the sky, he thought about the farm. The linden trees. The horizontal light. Old Burris on the warm stones of the doorstep. The ringing in his ears continued, soft and high and very far away. he breathed. The second assault came at 10:30. It was different from the first, less probing, more deliberate, as though the morning's exchange had been a question and this was the considered answer. They came at the gravel bar in greater numbers this time, and they came with covering fire from the ridge that was more organized, more patient, that walked methodically along the Polish bank looking for the places where men kept their heads and made those places difficult to keep. Tomasz did not think during it. This was the discovery of the second time, that there was no room in it for thinking. The body simply went, acquired its target, worked its bolt, acquired again, and the mind ran somewhere slightly behind all of this, observing rather than directing, noting things with a strange detached precision that seemed to have no emotional content whatsoever. The water catching the light on the bar. The way smoke moved in the still air. The particular sound a bolt makes when a cartridge feeds cleanly versus when it does not. It lasted longer than the first. 20 minutes, perhaps. Perhaps more. When it ended, the gravel bar was still Polish. Afterward, Tomasz sat against the wall and ate the bread and kielbasa that Joseph had offered him that morning. He ate it without tasting it, mechanically, because Joseph had said you should eat, and Joseph had, so far, been right about everything he had said and wrong about nothing, and this seemed like sufficient reason. His hands had stopped shaking faster this time. He noticed this without knowing what to make of it. The afternoon settled in around them. This was the thing no one had told him about, not the old man in the village, not the officers, not the films or the stories. The waiting between. The way battle was not a continuous thing but an interrupted one, a thing that came and withdrew and left behind it these long, suspended stretches of ordinary time that were somehow stranger than the fighting itself. Because in the fighting the body knew what to do. In the waiting between, the body had nothing to do and the mind had everything to do, and neither of them was particularly suited to the task. The sun had burned through the thin cloud and was now making a sincere effort at warmth, falling at a low angle along the river valley, catching the water in long glittering lines. Dragonflies had appeared from somewhere, blue ones, the kind he remembered from the pond at the edge of his uncle's farm, hovering above the reeds along the bank with that improbable, jeweled stillness. The world's absolute indifference to its own beauty continued to astonish him. "Tell me something," he said to Joseph. Joseph, who was doing something meticulous and indefinable to the mechanism of his rifle, did not look up. "What sort of something?" "Anything. Tell me about your daughter." A pause. Joseph's hands continued their work. Then something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not openly, but in the small incremental way that a closed door shifts when something moves on the other side of it. "She is afraid of geese," he said. "Geese. Specifically our neighbor's geese. Pani Wróbel keeps 4 of them. They are, objectively, unpleasant animals. Zosha has been afraid of them since she could walk." He turned the rifle slightly in his hands, examining something along the barrel. "But she has also decided that she will not be afraid of them. So every morning she goes to the fence and she stands there and she looks at the geese and the geese look at her. And neither of them moves. They stand there for 5-10 minutes sometimes. Her and 4 geese. Just looking at each other." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to watch from the kitchen window. She doesn't know I watched." Tomasz thought about this. "Does it work? The standing there?" "Not yet. She is still afraid of them." Joseph set the rifle across his knees and looked at it, then looked at the river. "But she keeps going back." They sat with that for a while. Henrik, on Tomasz's other side, had produced a small notebook from somewhere inside his tunic and was writing in it with a pencil stub, bent over it with the focused, slightly hunched posture of someone who learned to write at a small desk and never entirely lost the habit of making himself small around the act of it. He wrote in a rapid, compressed hand, filling the small page with a density that suggested he was trying to put more in it than the page wanted to hold. "What are you writing?" Tomasz asked. Henrik glanced up. A faint color in his pale face, not quite an embarrassment, but its younger sibling. "Notes," he said. Notes. About he paused. About what it's like. What things look like. What the river sounds like. He looked down at the page.
I thought someone should. Tomasz considered this young man from Potnan, 1 year of university, Latin surfacing under pressure, writing notes about what the river sounds like in the afternoon after 2 German assaults, in a notebook small enough to fit in a uniform pocket. He thought about the impulse behind it, the human insistence on witnessing, on saying I was here and this is what it was, the deep refusal to let things simply disappear into time without being marked.
Good, he said.
Write it carefully. Henrik looked at him surprised, perhaps, that this would be the response, that there would be no gentle mockery, no soldier's deflection. Then he nodded, once, and bent back to the page.
Staszek had been quiet all morning.
This was the detail that sat in the back of Tomasz's mind through the afternoon, not with urgency, but with the low persistence of something that needs to be attended to. Staszek, who laughed loudly and often, who told long, elaborate stories about his father's butcher shop that were probably 60% invention, who had a gift for the kind of cheerful noise that fills a space and makes it feel inhabited. Staszek had been quiet since before the first shot was fired and had remained quiet and was still quiet now, sitting 3 meters down the trench with his broad shoulders against the wall and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance that had nothing visible in it. Tomasz moved along the trench to him. He sat down beside him without preamble, the way you sit beside someone you know well enough to dispense with the approach.
For a while neither of them said anything.
Mikolai owed me 2 zloty, Staszek said eventually. His voice was flat, factual, carrying the information in a way that kept it at arm's length.
I know, Tomasz said, though he had not known. From a card game.
3 weeks ago. Staszek blinked, once, slowly, still looking at the middle distance. He said he'd pay me when we got back to Lodz.
A pause.
He was always saying he'd do things when we got somewhere.
Tomasz did not say anything. He hummed all the time, Staszek said. It drove me absolutely insane.
I told him once, Mikolai, I will personally pour water in your ear if you do not stop that humming.
His jaw worked slightly. He just hummed quieter.
He thought that was very funny.
Tomasz nodded. It was annoying, Staszek said.
It was a very annoying habit.
Yes, Tomasz said.
They sat together in the afternoon sun, Tomasz and this large, quiet man who had been full of noise and was now full of something else, and the river went by below them in its old steady way, and the dragonflies moved over the reeds, and far away to the west the artillery continued its long, patient conversation with the earth. After a while, Staszek reached into his pocket and took out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it to reveal a playing card, the 7 of hearts, worn soft at the edges.
He looked at it. He folded it again and put it back. He'd have forgotten anyway, he said.
Probably, Tomasz agreed.
Something in Staszek's face rearranged itself.
Not quite a smile, nowhere close to a smile, really, but a slight softening, a small acknowledgement of something. He picked up his rifle and checked it, and the motion of checking it was the motion of a man returning to the present from somewhere else, which was what it needed to be.
Good card player, though, Staszek said.
Was he?
Terrible.
Absolutely terrible. You could read everything he thought right off his face.
He paused.
Which is why he owed me 2 zloty.
Tomasz left him to it and made his way back along the trench. The afternoon moved.
It moved the way September afternoons move in the Polish countryside, with a golden, slanting quality, the light going amber earlier than you expect, the shadows lengthening across the water with a kind of leisure that has no business existing alongside everything else that is happening. The river accepted the light the way it accepted everything, which was to say completely and without preference. Lieutenant Novak received a transmission sometime in the mid-afternoon. Tomasz could tell from the way he carried himself afterward a slight tightening, a recalibration of that careful composure that it had not been entirely good. He gathered the section leaders and spoke to them in a low voice for several minutes, standing in the wider part of the trench with a folded map, and the section leaders listened and nodded and returned to their positions with faces that had been adjusted, that were carrying something additional now and were managing it in the particular way of men who have been told something and have decided not to pass it along in full.
Tomasz did not ask what had been said. He thought he could infer it. The crossings north and south. The line being established.
The scale of the thing which was becoming clearer with every hour, not from any single piece of information but from the aggregate of small details that arrived from various directions and assembled themselves into a picture that he was beginning to be able to read even though no one had given him the key to it.
They were not stopping the invasion. They were costing it something. He was not sure, yet, how large a difference that was.
But he held on to it, costing it something as the thing that was true and present and accountable, because the other question, the larger question about what came next and what came after that, was a question the afternoon could not answer and he did not have the resources to spend on it.
He sat in the sun. He thought about Marta's letter.
He thought about the specific sentence near the bottom of the page, the one in the hurried, smaller handwriting. I am not going to tell you not to be afraid because I think you will be afraid regardless of what I say and I think that is probably right. But I want you to know that I will be sitting at the kitchen table every evening and the lamp will be on and when you come back you will be able to see it from the lane.
The lamp in the window.
He let himself see it clearly, precisely the particular warm yellow of it, the way it lit the white curtain from behind, the shape it made on the lane outside in the dark. He let himself see it with everything he had, because this was the kind of seeing that cost nothing and gave something back, and right now the exchange rate on that kind of thing was very favorable.
Joseph was watching him.
Not intrusively, just with that quiet, peripheral attention he brought to things, the carpentry attention, the attention of a man who looks at a thing to understand what it's made of and how it fits together.
What are you thinking about? Joseph asked.
A lamp, Tomasz said. Joseph considered this for a moment, then nodded, as though lamp were a perfectly complete and satisfying answer to the question, as though he understood exactly and needed no further information.
Good, he said,
and turned back to the river.
The sun moved lower. The shadows crossed the water.
The dragonflies disappeared as the air cooled, gone back to wherever dragonflies go, their small jeweled errands complete for the day. The birch trees on the far bank caught the last of the amber light along their white trunks and held it briefly, luminous, before the dusk began to gather in the spaces between them. Somewhere downstream, the blackbird sang its evening iteration, a different phrase now, slower, the day song giving way to something quieter and more considered, as though it too was taking stock.
Tomasz listened. The ringing in his ears had not gone away, but he realized, stopped noticing it. It had become part of the background, part of the sound of the day.
He supposed this was how things worked, not that the difficult thing went away, but that you learned to hear around it, to find the blackbird inside the ringing, to locate the river beneath all the other noise.
He thought this might be the most important skill he had learned today.
More important, even, than the other things. The order came at dusk.
Not loudly.
Orders, Tomasz had learned, did not always come loudly. Sometimes they came as Lieutenant Novak moving along the trench in the last of the grey light, stopping at each man, speaking in a low and level voice, and the words themselves were simple: we move at 2100. Travel light, stay close. No lights, and the simplicity of them was either reassuring or the opposite, depending on what you brought to the listening. Tomasz brought a tiredness so complete it had gone past the feeling of tiredness into something quieter and more fundamental, a kind of deep bodily honesty, every part of him accounted for and present and simply, plainly exhausted.
His shoulders ached from the weight of the day.
His eyes felt as though they had been looking at things for a very long time, which they had.
He packed what needed packing. It was not much.
He had been told when they arrived at this position what to carry, and he had carried it, and now he redistributed it: ammunition first, then rations, then the small collection of personal things that lived in the bottom of his pack and constituted, in aggregate, the portable version of his life.
A spare pair of socks. His father's clasp knife, bone-handled, the blade worn thin from 40 years of sharpening. The photograph of the farm taken the summer before last, slightly creased, showing the house and the linden trees and, at the left edge, barely visible, the shoulder and elbow of someone who had moved at the wrong moment and been partially erased by motion. He thought that was probably Marta. He had always meant to ask. He put the photograph away and looked out at the river one last time. The dusk had done what dusk does to water, turned it from a thing that caught and returned light into a thing that held darkness, that was the same color now as the sky above it and the bank below it, that was more sound than sight. He could hear it perfectly. The low, continuous murmur of it, patient and unhurried, making the same sounds over the same stones it had been making sounds over since before anyone alive had been alive to hear it. He thought, I will not see this river again. He did not know if this was true. He suspected it might be. He held briefly the thought, and the river, and the fact that holding the thought was as close as he could come to holding the river, and then he turned away and picked up his rifle. They moved at 2100, as ordered. Single file, keeping to the lower ground, following the path of the river north for perhaps 2 kilometers before turning east along a farm track that ran between dark fields of unharvested grain. The grain stood on both sides of them, tall and very still in the windless night, and moving between it, Tomasz had the sensation of moving through something that was itself alive, that had its own slow, patient life proceeding on either side of him in the dark, regardless of what was happening among the men who had planted it and would not now be coming to bring it in. The moon was not yet up. The stars were. He had not looked at the stars since before the morning, and they surprised him not by being different, but by being exactly the same. The same stars, in the same arrangements, hanging over the same sky, performing their same ancient, indifferent, beautiful business of simply being there and being innumerable. He looked at them for as long as he could while still watching his footing on the uneven track, which was not very long, but it was enough to absorb something from them. Some quality of duration. Some reminder that the scale of things varied enormously depending on where you chose to stand. Joseph was directly ahead of him. Henrik directly behind. They walked without speaking. The column moved with that particular focused quiet of men who have been told the importance of quiet and have taken it seriously, the soft compression of boots on earth, the occasional small clink of equipment, the sound of breathing, the sound of the grain on either side shifting barely, a dry whisper, as the column's passage displaced the air. These were the sounds of men moving through a night that did not yet know they were there, and preserving that ignorance was the only thing that mattered. Tomasz concentrated on Joseph's back. The shape of it, the familiar set of the shoulders, the way the pack rode slightly high on the left side from a strap that had been repaired and never sat quite right afterward. He fixed on this and walked. He did not think about what was behind them on the river, what was moving through the birch trees on the far bank, what would find the empty trench in the morning and read from it the direction of departure. He thought about Joseph's pack and the path under his feet and the next step and the step after that. This, he was learning, was how large distances were covered. One step, completely, then the next one. They had been walking perhaps an hour when Henrik came up alongside him, matching his pace. "Do you know where we're going?" he said. Barely a whisper. "East," Tomasz said. "I know east. Do you know where east leads tonight?" "Somewhere with a roof, if we're fortunate." Henrik was quiet for a moment, walking. Then, "I've been thinking about the letter." Tomasz looked at him in the dark. The young man's face was a pale shape under the helmet, barely visible. "What letter?" "Any letter. The letters we should be writing." He adjusted his rifle on his shoulder. "I keep thinking that the people at home, my mother, my father, they don't know where we are tonight. They don't know that we were on the river this morning or that we're walking down this track now. They are just sitting somewhere, not knowing." Tomasz thought about the lamp in the window, the kitchen table. "Yes," he said. "It seems strange that the two things can exist at the same time. Them not knowing, and us." He gestured at the track, the fields, the dark.
encompassing all of it in the small motion. It's always been that way, Tomasz said. People not knowing what the people they love are doing at any given moment. Usually it doesn't matter as much. Usually it's just that you're in a field or on a road somewhere and they don't know and it's fine.
Henrik considered this.
I suppose, he said. I suppose the not knowing is the same. It's just the thing being not known that's different.
Go back to your position, Tomasz said, not unkindly.
Save the thinking for when we stop.
Henrik dropped back. Tomasz walked.
The farm track broadened eventually into a proper road, cobblestoned, running through flat, open country, the kind of road that in peacetime would have led reliably from one ordinary place to another. They followed it for a while and then left it for a field path that ran southeast through the dark, and the columns strung out along it like a careful thought, and the stars moved slowly overhead, and somewhere far to the west the artillery still spoke, so distant now that it was less a sound than a feeling, a low vibration in the lower registers of everything, a basso continuo beneath the night.
It had not stopped all day. Tomasz thought about that.
The scale of resource required to maintain that sound continuously, for he counted 16 hours now, perhaps more. The number of guns, the number of shells, the number of men required to feed the guns, the number of vehicles required to supply the men. He thought about the machinery of it, the logistics of it, the sheer organizational enormity of what was running in the dark to the west, and then he stopped thinking about it because it was the kind of thinking that led somewhere without a floor, somewhere that kept going down, and he did not have the resources tonight to fall.
Step, step. The path under his feet. Joseph's pack, riding slightly high on the left. They came to the village at perhaps midnight.
It was small, a dozen houses along a single road, a church with a modest steeple, a well in the central square, several outbuildings.
Most of the houses were dark.
One had a light in the window, a real light, warm and yellow, the kind of light that came from inside a lived-in room, and Tomasz felt something move through him at the sight of it that was so sudden and so specific that it was a moment before he recognized it as longing. Simple, uncomplicated longing, for warmth and light and the interior of a room.
The column halted in the square. Orders passed down in whispers. 2 hours rest. Maintain readiness. No fires.
Men dispersed to the outbuildings, the stable, the covered space beside the church. Tomasz found himself in a barn, the smell of it reaching him before his eyes adjusted to the dark, the deep, lead smell of old hay and animals, and the particular dusty sweetness of stored grain.
He stood in the smell of it for a moment and let it be what it was. A barn smell.
An ancient, ordinary, deeply human smell that had existed for thousands of years before this morning and would exist for thousands of years after it. He found a place against the far wall, beside a wooden partition where a horse had presumably spent many quiet nights, and sat down in the hay. Joseph appeared from the dark and sat beside him. Then Staszek, then Henrik, assembling by some instinct that operated below the level of decision, the instinct of men who have been through something together and find each other in the dark without needing to explain why.
They sat in a row against the wall. For a while no one said anything.
Then Staszek said, very quietly, "My father made sausage on Thursday evenings."
No one asked him to explain this.
It did not seem to require explanation.
Every Thursday, he went on. My whole life. The whole house smelled of it. Garlic and marjoram, and he paused. And whatever it was he put in that nobody else put in. He never told me what it was.
He said he'd tell me when I was old enough to take over the shop.
A pause.
I'm 25 and I still don't know.
Tomasz leaned his head back against the wooden partition.
Above them, in the high dark of the barn roof, something small moved in the rafters, a sparrow or a bat, the soft percussion of wings, then stillness. The hay under him was prickly and real and smelled of summer, of the August that had just been, of warm dry days before the world changed its mind about what days were for. My mother made beet soup on Sundays, Henrik said.
His voice in the dark was young and careful. She made it from beets she grew herself in the kitchen garden. She was particular about the beets. She would walk the rows every morning and check each plant individually. A quiet breath. I used to think this was excessive. She had maybe 20 beet plants. It took her an hour. Another breath.
Now I think it was not about the beets. What was it about?
Stashek asked. I don't know exactly. Something about caring for specific things.
Knowing them individually.
He thought for a moment. She knew each plant. Not as a type of plant. As that plant. The barn was very quiet. Tomasz thought about his father's hands.
He thought about the clasp knife in his pack, 40 years of sharpening, the blade worn thin, used for everything and carefully maintained, the handle smooth from that long use, carrying in its bone and steel the shape of every task it had been equal to.
He thought about what an object like that carried that was not the object itself.
What it held of the person who had held it. Tell me about your wife, he said to Joseph. In the dark, he felt rather than saw Joseph's expression change, that same shifting of something behind a closed door.
Her name is Anna, Joseph said. She is practical.
More practical than I am, which is saying something.
A brief pause. She can fix anything. Anything mechanical.
She understands how things work in a way that I admire enormously and cannot replicate. Last winter the kitchen stove stopped drawing properly, and I spent an afternoon looking at it and understanding nothing, and she looked at it for 3 minutes and fixed it. Something in his voice that was adjacent to laughter but not quite arrived there. She didn't make a thing of it. She just fixed it and went back to what she was doing.
She sounds formidable, Henrik said.
She is, Joseph said. She is completely formidable. The word carried a weight of tenderness that it does not usually carry.
Zosha has her eyes. And her stubbornness. He was quiet for a moment.
I think the goose business is entirely her mother's influence.
Outside, the village was quiet. Somewhere a dog was moving around the soft pad of it, the occasional creak of a gate. The distant artillery had diminished to something so far away it was almost nothing, almost only felt and not heard. The stars would be moving overhead, beyond the barn roof, making their slow and ancient circuit, measuring out the night in the only units they knew. Tomasz closed his eyes. He did not intend to sleep.
He intended to rest for a moment, to let the body have a moment of horizontal honesty, and then he intended to be awake and ready when the 2 hours expired.
This was his intention.
But the hay was real beneath him, and the smell of it was real, and the warmth of the men on either side of him was real, and his body had been waiting all day for permission to lay down the weight of the day, and so it did.
He was asleep within minutes. He dreamed of the farm.
Not the farm as it had been on any specific day, but the farm as a composite, a distillation, the linden trees and the morning light and the sound of the well and old Burris on the warm stones and Marta's voice from somewhere inside the house, not saying anything specific, just the fact of her voice, its familiar tone and cadence, its particular quality of being present.
The lamp was in the window. He could see it from the lane.
Someone touched his shoulder and he was awake. Not gradually, completely, in that same soldier's way, the way he had watched Joseph do it on the riverbank yesterday morning, which was either a very long time ago or no time at all, depending on which part of him was doing the measuring. He was awake and his hand was on his rifle, and the barn was grey with the first diluted light coming through the gaps in the boards before he had finished understanding that he had been asleep.
Joseph was crouching beside him. Time, Joseph said. That was all. Time.
As though time were a place they were being asked to return to from wherever sleep had taken them, as though wakefulness were a destination requiring navigation.
Tomasz sat up.
The hay crackled under him. His back had opinions about the night on the barn floor that were detailed and emphatic, and he noted them and set them aside. Around him the barn was filling with the sounds of men waking, the shifting, the low voices, the mechanical sounds of equipment being checked and adjusted. Henrik was already sitting up, hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, notebook open in his lap, writing something in the thin early light with the focused urgency of a man trying to capture something before it becomes inaccessible. Stashek was standing at the barn door looking out at the village square with his arms folded, his broad back a dark shape against the grey rectangle of morning.
Tomasz stood.
He ate a piece of hard bread from his pack and drank water from his canteen and watched the light come through the boards and thought about nothing in particular, which was a form of rest available even when sleep was not.
They moved out at 5.
The countryside had changed overnight. Or perhaps it had not changed and he was simply seeing it differently with different eyes, the eyes of a man moving through it rather than waiting in one part of it, eyes that were therefore obliged to take in more of it at once. The flat fields of the water valley were behind them now and the land was rising slightly, gently, into low rolling country with woodlands on the higher ground and scattered farms in the valleys between.
Harvest country.
Late summer country, smelling of dry earth and the sweetness of grain standing too long in the field.
It was the standing grain that got him.
Field after field of it, wheat and rye and barley, tall and heavy-headed and perfectly, achingly ready, the kind of ready that a farmer knows in his body before he knows it in his mind, the kind that says now, today, this week at the latest, and none of it being cut. All of it standing in the September morning light, bent slightly under its own weight, waiting with the patience of a thing that does not know how to be impatient but is running out of time regardless.
He thought about the families who had planted it, where they were this morning,
whether they had left or were still somewhere in those farmhouses they passed, shuttered and closed, or whether the houses were empty and the families were on the roads east with everything they could carry and the grain would stand until the weather changed and brought it down.
He thought about what it meant to leave a harvest.
What particular quality of desperation was required to walk away from a field that was ready, to put your back to the thing you had tended from seed, to choose movement over the crop you needed to live?
He had never had to make that choice.
He had been a farmer's nephew, not a farmer, but he had spent enough harvests to know the weight of them, the urgency and the satisfaction and the bone-deep tiredness of the bringing in, the way a community bent itself collectively toward the work like a river bending toward its destination.
All of that, abandoned.
All of that standing in the light, waiting for a harvest that would not come.
He walked and tried not to think about it and thought about it anyway.
They met the first refugees mid-morning. A family on a cart, a man of perhaps 50 driving, a woman beside him, 3 children in the bed of the cart among bundled possessions. A mattress, incongruously, strapped to the side. A birdcage with something small and brown inside it that may or may not have still been alive. The man pulled up when he saw the column and looked at the soldiers with the expression of someone performing a rapid, complex calculation whether soldiers moving east were a good sign or a bad one, whether to stop or continue, what information was available and what could be inferred from it.
Novak stopped to speak with him. Tomasz could not hear the exchange.
He watched the farmer's face, the careful way Novak listened, the brief nod, the way Novak's expression absorbed something and held it and did not let it surface. The farmer's wife was looking at the column of soldiers the way you look at weather, assessing, not judging, trying to read from it what was coming and how soon.
The children were very quiet.
The youngest, perhaps 4 years old, was sitting in the cart with a blanket across her lap watching the soldiers pass with eyes that were large and dark and utterly without guile, taking everything in with the pure receptive attention of a child who has not yet learned to look at difficult things sideways.
Tomasz caught her eye as he passed. He did not know what his face did.
Whatever it did, the child looked at it for a moment and then, without smiling exactly, gave a small nod, a gravely courteous acknowledgment, one traveler to another, as though she had assessed him and found him acceptable. Then she looked away.
He carried that nod for a long time.
Novak fell back into step beside Tomasz. "Germans are at Czestochowa," he said quietly.
Not looking at him.
Just carrying the information forward in his voice, placing it between them like an object on a table.
Or near it. The man wasn't certain.
He left this morning before light.
Czestochowa.
25 kilometers west of the position they had held yesterday morning. A city with the Jasna Gora monastery on the hill above it, which every Polish child knew, which was as close to the center of something as anything Tomasz could name.
And the army? Tomasz asked.
Fighting.
A pause. Retreating and fighting.
Further south.
Another pause. We are not isolated.
But we are. Novak searched for the word with the careful precision of a man who chooses his words around the men who will have to carry them. We are making our own way for now.
Making our own way.
Tomasz turned this phrase over,
examined it from several angles,
found that it was true and that it was incomplete and that the incompleteness was intentional and that this was, perhaps, exactly the right word for right now.
East, he said.
East, Novak confirmed. Then, quietly, almost to himself, and then we'll see.
He moved up the column.
They stopped at midday in a wood. Beech trees, mostly old ones, the bark smooth and grey, the canopy high and interlocking overhead in a way that made the light coming through it green and diffuse and strangely peaceful. The floor of the wood was deep in last year's leaves, soft underfoot, and the whole space had the quality of a large, quiet room bounded, sheltered, smelling of earth and moss and the particular stillness of old trees.
Tomasz sat with his back against a beech tree and looked up through the canopy.
The leaves were just beginning to turn at their edges, the first faint yellowing, the summer's green fading by degrees toward the gold it would become. In 3 weeks, 4 weeks, this would be extraordinary. Amber and copper and the deep red of the beech at its turning, the whole canopy lit from within by the slow combustion of the season. He had seen it before. In woods like this, that particular October light filtered through turning beeches, the way it fell warm and dense as if the trees themselves were the source of it.
He wondered who would walk through this wood in October, whether anyone would notice. He thought, someone will notice. Someone always notices.
Whatever else happens, in October someone will walk through this wood and look up at the canopy, and the beauty of it will reach them whether they are looking for beauty or not, because that is what beauty does. It arrives without asking permission. It insists on itself inside even the most difficult things.
He held on to this. Henrik appeared and sat beside him.
He had his notebook closed now, tucked back inside his tunic, but his hands had the slightly ink-marked quality of someone who had been writing recently.
He looked up at the canopy with the same attention Tomasz had been giving it.
My professor, he said, Professor Lewandowski, Tomasz had come to understand, was a reliable harbor in Henrik's thinking, a fixed point he returned to when the current was strong, used to say that the ability to notice beauty in difficult circumstances was not escapism. He said it was a form of resistance. Resistance to what?
Tomasz asked. Henrik thought about this.
To the idea that difficult circumstances were the only truth, that they were the whole of what was real.
He looked at the canopy.
I think I understand it better today than I did in the lecture hall.
Tomasz nodded slowly.
My father used to say something simpler, he said. He used to say when things were hard, when the harvest was bad or something broke that couldn't easily be fixed, he would say, the sky is still the sky.
Henrik considered this.
That's very good.
He was a very simple man.
In the best sense. The best sense is the only sense worth having for that word, Henrik said.
They sat under the beeches and let the green light fall over them.
From somewhere further in the wood, Tomasz could hear Staszek's voice, low, but recognizably his, with the cadence of a story, a long sentence followed by a shorter one and then a pause for effect.
Someone was laughing, quietly.
He could not see who, but the sound of it, the real, involuntary, helpless quality of genuine laughter, however small and however quiet, arrived in his chest like something he had not known he was hungry for until he heard it.
He thought about Joseph.
Joseph was sitting some distance away, slightly apart, doing nothing visible, just sitting with his back against a beech tree and his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance. He had the look of a man who was somewhere else, not absent, not distracted, but deliberately and with great precision inhabiting another place, the way a skilled carpenter can measure a space with his eyes from across a room without moving.
He was somewhere in Krakow.
He was watching Zosia at the fence, looking at the geese. He was watching Anna fix the stove with her 3 minutes of attention and her quiet competence.
Tomasz did not go to him.
Some kinds of being somewhere else needed to be left alone to finish.
In the early afternoon they heard aircraft.
Distant at first, a low drone at the edge of hearing, easily mistaken for wind in the high canopy. Then closer, and not mistakable. The column had halted instinctively before any order was given, every man looking up through the branches, and the trees that had been shelter became the only shelter, and the green light that had been peaceful became something they were grateful for.
The aircraft passed to the south, not directly overhead.
Tomasz could see them through gaps in the canopy, 3 shapes, very high, moving southeast with the methodical purpose of things that know where they are going and are confident of their welcome there.
He
watched them until the canopy closed around them and they were gone, leaving only the receding drone, and then silence, and then the birds resuming what the drone had interrupted.
No one spoke for a moment.
Then Novak said quietly, "Move," and the column moved.
Tomasz walked.
He watched the sky through the trees as the wood thinned toward its eastern edge, where the beach gave way to younger growth and then to open fields again, the light going from green to gold as the afternoon held on, the shadows of the trees long across the path. He thought about the aircraft with the detached, practical part of his mind heading southeast, probably from the west, definitely not Polish. 3 of them, and then set it aside because it was information he could do nothing with, and carrying information you can do nothing with was a weight with no return on the investment.
He thought instead about the beech trees, the turning leaves. October. Someone will notice.
He held onto that with the same quality of grip with which he held the rifle, not tight, not loose, but steady. The grip of a man who has learned today what things are worth holding and has made his quiet decisions accordingly. The column came out of the wood into the late afternoon light. The fields opened before them golden, enormous, the sky above them wide and very blue, the horizon east a dark line of distant trees.
The road ran straight toward it.
Somewhere along that road was whatever came next, which he could not see and could not predict and had learned today not to spend himself on predicting.
He walked, step and step.
Joseph ahead of him,
Henrik behind.
The road under his feet solid and real and accountable, leading where it led. The sky was still the sky.
They smelled the town before they saw it.
Not the smell of a town as Tomasz knew it, bread and coal smoke and the animal warmth of a market day, the particular layered human smell of a place where people had been living their ordinary lives in close proximity for generations.
What reached him on the evening air was different, sharper.
The smell of things burned that were not meant to be burned, timber and plaster, and the acrid chemicals, something of materials the fire had not entirely finished with.
He noted it without expression.
He had been noting things without expression for 2 days now and was developing, he thought, a certain proficiency at it.
A kind of ledger-keeping. This happened. And then this. And now this.
The entries did not require comment. They required only that he continue moving east, 1 step at a time, and keep the people around him in his peripheral vision, and breathe. The road crested a low rise and the town appeared below them in the last of the evening light. It was not large a market town, the kind that existed at the intersection of 2 roads because at some point in the past that had been a sensible place for things to happen, and the habit of it had accumulated over centuries into streets and houses and a church with a copper-green steeple and a square with linden trees.
Most of it was intact.
But at the western edge, where the road came in from the direction they had not come from, 3 buildings were gone, reduced to their foundations and the lower courses of their walls, standing open to the sky, the interior spaces still faintly smoking in the cooling evening air.
Tomasz looked at the spaces where the buildings had been.
There was something particularly disorienting about a destroyed building, he was finding. Something that the mind resisted in a way it did not resist other kinds of damage. A broken tool, a fallen tree, a flooded field, these were legible, they followed from comprehensible forces. But a building, which was the most deliberate of human constructions, the most purposeful arrangement of material toward the end of shelter and permanence, a building reduced to its foundation, was a kind of argument he did not know how to answer. It said something about the relationship between intention and outcome that he preferred not to hear. He looked away and followed the column into the square. The town was occupied not by the enemy, not yet, but by the displaced. They were everywhere. In the square, along the streets, inside the church whose doors stood open and through which Tomasz could see, as he passed, the rows of people sitting in the pews and on the floor between them, filling the space with the particular quality of human endurance that has no name but is recognizable immediately. That is the look of people who have been waiting for a long time and have made a kind of peace with waiting without making peace with what made it necessary. Families with carts. Families with nothing. Men without families. Old women sitting on bundles with the focused, inward expression of people conserving something. Children, some sleeping, some watching the soldiers pass with that same unguarded attention as the child on the cart that morning. Lieutenant Novak spoke to someone, a local man, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to small authority, a mayor or a councillor or simply a man the others had decided to organize around in the absence of other options. They spoke for several minutes. The local man pointed twice, once north, once east, and his face throughout the conversation had the quality of a face that has already absorbed more than it was designed to absorb and is managing the overflow through a kind of deliberate compression. The column was billeted in a warehouse near the eastern edge of the square, a grain merchant's building, long and low, smelling of dust and the ghosts of 100 harvests. Civilian families were already sheltering at one end, separated from the soldiers' section by nothing more than an understood line, a mutual recognition of the arrangement. Children slept in the corners. A woman was nursing an infant in the lamplight with the specific focus of a person for whom the immediate, physical, present task is the whole of the world and is sufficient. Tomasz set down his pack and sat on the floor and looked at the lamp. It was a simple oil lamp on a crate, burning steadily, throwing its warm circle on the warehouse wall. He watched it the way he had been watching things all day, with the careful, noting attention of a man who has decided that seeing things clearly is the closest he can come to understanding them, and that understanding them is not always necessary as long as he can see them clearly. The flame was very still in the closed air of the warehouse. He went outside an hour later, needing the night air, needing the sky above him rather than a ceiling. The square was quieter now. Most of the displaced had found their places for the night inside the church, inside the houses whose owners had opened them, in the warehouse, along the covered walkway that ran one side of the square beneath an arcade of stone arches. A few people still moved through the space, slowly, with the muted purposefulness of late evening. He stood at the edge of the square and looked up. The stars again. The same stars are patient, innumerable, making their slow circuit. He found the ones he knew, the bright one due south that his father had pointed out to him when he was small, standing in the field behind the house on a clear winter night. That one, Tomek. Remember that one, it's always there. He found it now, south and steady. He heard footsteps and turned. An old man was crossing the square with the careful, deliberate pace of someone navigating on unsteady legs. Very old, 80, perhaps more, the kind of age that carries itself differently from other ages, with a different relationship to time and hurry. He wore a dark coat buttoned to the collar despite the mild evening, and he moved with a stick, each step considered and then committed to. He saw Tomasz and stopped. For a moment they looked at each other across the corner of the square, the old man and the young soldier, with a particular mutual assessment of people who have ended up, through different routes and different decades, at the same unlikely place on the same unlikely night. The old man came toward him. He stopped a meter away and looked at Tomasz with eyes that were dark and very clear, and had clearly seen a great deal and had made certain decisions about what to do with what they'd seen. He looked at the uniform, the rifle, the face. Then he said, in a voice that was old but not weak, "The last time they came, I was your age." Tomasz looked at him. 1914, the old man said. He was not performing it, not dramatizing, just stating, placing one fact beside another with the practical economy of someone who has been carrying facts for a long time and knows their weight. Different uniforms. Same road.
He gestured with the stick toward the western entrance to the square, the road coming in from the direction of the burned buildings.
I stood there and watched them come in.
He paused. I thought it was the worst thing. And now? Tomasz asked.
The old man considered him for a moment. Then he said, Now I think it was practice. He looked away, out across the square toward the church. The lamplight from the open doors lay across the cobblestones in a long pale rectangle. But the other thing I thought in 1914 was that it would not end, that there was no shape to it, no after, that it would simply continue until there was nothing left to continue with.
And it did end, Tomasz said.
It did end, the old man said. He said it without triumph, without the satisfaction of a man proving a point.
He said it as a plain fact, the plainest possible fact.
It ended, and the grain was still here, and the church was still here, and I was still here, which surprised me more than the other things.
He turned the stick in his hands. I had 2 sons.
One came back.
The square was quiet around them. Tomasz thought about the grain in the fields,
the unharvested wheat standing in the September dark, patient and ready, waiting for hands that were somewhere on the roads east.
Which one came back? He asked. He didn't know why he asked this. It seemed important. The old man looked at him with those clear, old eyes.
The younger, he said. Then, after a moment, he's in the church tonight, with his grandchildren. Something moved in Tomasz's chest, slow and wordless, some reconfiguration that did not have a name but felt like the movement of something settling into a different position, finding a new balance. I have to ask you something, the old man said.
Ask.
Are you afraid? Tomasz thought about this honestly, the way the question deserved to be thought about, not with the reflex of the answer a soldier is supposed to give, not with false modesty, but with the actual, present, truthful account of what was in him.
Yes, he said.
The old man nodded as though this was the right answer, the only answer worth giving.
Good, he said.
Fear is the part of you that knows what things are worth.
He looked at the stars briefly.
The men who stopped being afraid, in my experience, stopped being careful about what they were preserving. Fear is not the enemy.
He paused.
Despair is the enemy. What's the difference?
The old man thought for a moment.
Then, fear looks at what's in front of it. Despair looks past it, to the end, and decides the end is not worth the distance.
He turned the stick in his hands again. Don't look that far.
Look at what's in front of you.
Tomasz thought about Joseph's pack, the strap sitting high on the left,
about the path under his feet and the step after this step, about the specific, manageable distance between here and the next thing.
How did you know to say that? He asked.
The old man looked at him with something that was close to, but not quite, a smile. I was you once, he said simply. On a different road. In different mud. He nodded once, that same courteous, grave acknowledgement as the child on the cart that morning, one traveller to another, and turned, and made his slow, careful, deliberate way across the cobblestones toward the church.
Tomasz watched him go.
He watched until the old man reached the church steps and navigated them, one at a time, with his stick, and passed through the open door into the lamplight, and was gone.
The square was empty now.
The linden trees stood quietly in the dark, their late summer leaves barely moving.
The stars were overhead.
The cobblestones under his feet were old, centuries old, set by hands long gone, worn smooth by generations of ordinary people, walking across an ordinary square on ordinary mornings, going about the ordinary business of their lives.
He stood on them and breathed. Fear looks at what's in front of it. He looked at what was in front of him. The warehouse, across the square, the lamplight in the doorway,
Joseph inside, sleeping already, practically certainly,
Henrik, writing in his notebook,
Stashek, sitting quietly with the 7 of hearts folded in his pocket.
He thought about Marta's lamp in the window.
He thought about it very specifically, the shape of the flame, the white curtain lit from behind, the yellow warmth of it on the lane outside. He let himself see it completely, not as comfort exactly, but as fact. A fact about what was waiting. A lamp that was on. A table that was there. He breathed once, slowly, feeling the night air move through him. Then he turned and walked back across the old stones toward the light in the warehouse doorway, and went inside. He slept without dreaming this time. Or perhaps he dreamed, and the dreams were so quiet, so texturally similar to sleep itself, that they left no impression, dissolved back into the dark the way morning mist dissolves, leaving only the faint sense that something had been there, something gentle, before the waking came. He was grateful for this. He had not known until last night that dreamless sleep was a gift, that the absence of images could be its own kind of mercy. Joseph woke him at 3. Not with words, just a hand on his shoulder, the same hand, the same pressure, the same economy of communication. Tomasz was upright before he was fully present, the body moving through its protocols while the mind assembled itself behind, catching up piece by piece. The warehouse. The lamp burned down now to a low flutter. The shapes of sleeping civilians in the far corner, the infant quiet, the woman beside it with her head on a folded coat. He stood and adjusted his pack and picked up his rifle and was a soldier again. They moved out of the town in the dark, the column forming up in the square with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this enough times now, twice, only twice, but twice was enough that it had a shape to it, a muscle memory. The linden trees stood in the dark above the cobblestones. The church doors were closed now. The old man was somewhere inside, sleeping, and his son was somewhere inside with the grandchildren, and all of them were sleeping in the old stones of the old church on the old square, and Tomasz walked past it and did not look back. Or he did look back, once, briefly. The steeple against the stars. That was all. Then the road took him east and the town fell behind. The night walking was different from the day walking. Quieter in the obvious sense, less to see, less to process, the world reduced to the road immediately ahead and the shape of Joseph moving through the dark in front of him and the sound of Henrik's breathing behind. But also quieter in a deeper sense, a sense that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. The night asked less of him. The darkness that removed the landscape from view also removed, temporarily, the evidence of what was happening to the landscape. The burned buildings, the standing grain, the abandoned farmsteads with their closed shutters and their suggestion of everything left behind. In the dark, the road was just a road. The fields on either side were just darkness, and darkness was neutral, and he could walk through neutral darkness for a long time without accumulating the weight he had been accumulating all day. He walked and let his mind go where it needed to go. It went to his father, which surprised him slightly. He had thought about his mother and Marta often since the river natural, the people who were waiting, the people connected to him by the active present tense of worry and love. But his father had been dead for 4 years, and the dead occupied a different part of memory, a quieter region where things were kept rather than actively tended. Tonight his father arrived without invitation and simply walked beside him in the dark, which was something his father would have done in life too, appearing without announcement, walking beside you, not necessarily saying anything. His father had been a man of considerable silences. Not cold silences, not the silence of a withheld man, a man who had retreated from his family into some interior weather that excluded them. The silence of a man who simply did not feel that speech was always the appropriate response to being alive, who could sit with you in a room or walk beside you on a road and be completely, attentively present without producing language about it. He had valued this in his father without knowing how to name it when he was young. He had a name for it now. Company, he thought. That was all. Just company. He walked with the memory of his father in the dark and felt, not comfort exactly, but something in the same neighborhood, a sense of being accompanied, of not being the only person to have ever walked a hard road at 3 in the morning wondering what came next. His father had not been in a war, but he had buried a child, a boy, between Tomasz and Marta, who had lived for 9 days. He had buried him in the spring, in the churchyard at the edge of the village, and he had gone back to the fields the following week because there were things in the fields that needed doing regardless, and he had done them, and he had continued.
Tomasz had been too young to understand this at the time. He understood it now.
In a way that was less understanding than recognition of the same motion, the same turning of the back toward grief because the road continued regardless, and the only meaningful response to a road that continued was to continue on it.
He walked.
After a while, Joseph dropped back until he was beside him.
This was unusual.
Joseph generally kept his position in the column with the same orderly precision he brought to everything, and Tomasz noted it without comment, waiting.
"Can't sleep while walking,"
Tomasz said eventually.
"I don't sleep while walking.
That's a different man's skill."
"Pity." They walked in silence for a few steps.
The road was straight here, running between flat fields, and ahead of them the column was a dark, quiet serpent moving through the darker night, the shapes of men resolving and dissolving as clouds moved across the stars.
"I want to ask you something," Joseph said. "Ask."
A pause, not the pause of a man uncertain whether to ask, but the pause of a man who has decided to ask and is choosing the right form for the question, the way a carpenter measures twice before the cut. "When we get through this," he said it without any performance of certainty, without the false confidence of when over if, just placing it on the road between them as a working assumption, a practical hypothesis. "What will you do first?"
Tomasz thought about this.
He did not give the first answer that came, which was something about the farm, because the farm was complicated, and he sensed that wasn't what Joseph was asking, not the place, not the setting, but the specific first thing, the first deliberate act on the other side of all of this.
"Sleep in my own bed," he said. "Then sit in the kitchen while Marta makes tea. Not do anything.
Just sit there while she does it and be in the room while ordinary things happen."
Joseph nodded, as though this was precise and correct.
"You?"
Tomasz asked.
"Walk to school with Zosha," Joseph said,
without hesitation.
He had clearly known his answer for some time, had been carrying it, Tomasz suspected, the way he carried the photograph inside his helmet, in the place where it was always present even when not being looked at.
"She started school in September.
I wasn't there for the first day."
He paused. Anna said.
"She wore her new coat and carried her bag like it was the most serious business in the world."
"It probably was," Tomasz said.
"It probably was," Joseph agreed. Something in his voice, quiet, private, turned inward. "I want to walk her to the gate.
That's all. Just that one walk."
"She doesn't need me to. She's perfectly capable. She'll walk in and hang up her coat and be absolutely fine and not look back."
A pause. "But I want to be there.
I want to be the one who walks her to the gate."
Tomasz listened to this and held it carefully. He thought about what it was to want something that specific, that ordinary. Not a large thing.
Not safety or resolution or the end of the war, just a specific morning, a school gate, a small girl in a new coat. The way large survival could be organized around such small, precise images. The way it perhaps needed to be needed the particular rather than the general, needed the school gate rather than peace, because peace was too large to walk toward and a school gate was exactly the right size for a man to fix his eyes on and keep moving.
"She'll look back," Tomasz said.
Joseph looked at him. "When she goes through the gate," Tomasz said.
"She'll look back once."
"They always do."
Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes.
I think so too."
They walked.
The night moved around them in its slow rotation, the stars wheeling imperceptibly, the road unwinding east through the dark. The artillery in the west had changed its quality again further now, or perhaps simply lower, the sound having found its floor, the constant become so constant that it lived in the body rather than the ears. He would miss it when it stopped, he thought. In some strange way he would miss it. It had become part of the texture of existing. He thought about the old man in the square. Fear looks at what's in front of it. In front of him, the road, and the column, and the shape of Joseph walking beside him, and somewhere ahead a dawn that had not yet committed to arriving but would.
It always did.
He had, in his 23 years of life, experienced 100% of dawns. Every night had ended, every dark had thinned eventually to grey and then to the first tentative light, and this was not hope exactly, but it was data, and data was something to walk on. He thought about the beech trees and the turning leaves. October, coming. Someone noticing. He thought about the blackbird at the river. The 3 seconds of it, bright and clear and completely indifferent to context, singing because it was a blackbird and blackbirds sang. Because that was the nature of blackbirds, and nature did not consult the calendar of human events before proceeding. The road ran on. The dawn came the way the old man had told him to expect things, from the front, not from some imagined distance. It arrived first as a lightening in the eastern sky, so gradual it was almost a decision rather than an event, a slow revision of the dark from absolute to approximate, grey seeping in at the horizon like water finding its level. Then the fields appeared on either side, grey at first, colourless, then slowly gathering their actual colours back from the night, the pale gold of the grain, the dark green of a woodline to the south, the particular brown of turned earth where someone had been ploughing. Then the sky went pink above the eastern tree line, and the pink became amber, and the amber became the first slant of actual light, horizontal and golden and very long across the flat land, catching every blade of standing grass and every stalk of standing grain and every wet stone on the road surface, and making of them briefly something that stopped the breath. Tomasz stopped walking. Just for a moment. Just to stand in it. Joseph stopped beside him, without question, without commentary. Behind them Henrik stopped, and then the pause rippled briefly through the column, men stopping, looking east, standing in the first light of the second morning, letting it arrive. No one spoke. The light moved across them the way light moves across a field, completely, without preference, touching everything equally, the rifle and the face and the road and the grain with the same golden indifference. A crow lifted from the woodline to the south and flew across the lit sky in a long, unhurried arc, black against the amber, and descended into the grain and was gone. Tomasz breathed in the morning air, cool, damp, carrying the smell of earth and distant water and the particular clean scent of early light, which was not really a scent but felt like one. He was very tired. He was tired in a way that had become permanent, structural, built into how he held himself, how he moved, how he looked at things. He would be tired, he suspected, for a long time. Some of what he was tired from had no cure except time. And time was a thing he had not yet been given enough of, and he was learning to be patient with this. But he was here. He was on the road, and the road was going somewhere, and the light was arriving over the eastern fields with its ancient indifference, and the crow had gone into the grain, and somewhere some distance east, some number of steps that was large but countable, there was whatever came next. He looked at the road in front of him. Step and step. Right, Joseph said, beside him. Quietly, practically, in the tone of a man who has assessed the situation and found it manageable. Just that one word, carrying everything it needed to carry. The column began to move again. Tomasz moved with it. The morning came on. The light strengthened. The fields ran gold on either side of the road, and the woodline to the south caught the sun along its upper edge, and the sky above it all was clearing to a blue that was thin and cold and honest and very, very large. The sky was still the sky. The village they came to was called Willa. It meant, roughly, the will of the oak, one of those old Polish place names that carried inside it the memory of a landscape that may or may not have still existed, named for something that had stood here once and given the place its character before the place had a name to give. There were still oaks. A stand of them at the northern edge of the village, old ones, the kind whose trunks required 2 men with arms extended to embrace, whose root systems went down into the earth as far as their canopies went up into the sky, whose entire existence was a kind of argument about duration. Tomasz noticed them as the column came in along the road. He noticed them the way he had been noticing things for 2 days, carefully, completely, with the full attention of a man who has learned that careful noticing is one of the things that keeps you present, that keeps the thread between you and the world intact. The oaks were perhaps 300 years old. Perhaps 400. They had been saplings when this road was a track between villages, when the fields on either side of it were being cleared for the first time by hands that were now entirely returned to the earth. They had stood through every hard century this country had accumulated, which was a considerable number of hard centuries, and they were still standing, their late summer crowns full and dark green and enormous against the morning sky. He walked past them slowly, looking up. One of them had a hollow in its trunk, a long vertical split, dark inside, large enough for a child to step into. He thought about all the children who must have stepped into it over the centuries, standing in the dark interior of a 400-year-old oak, looking out at whatever morning was available to them. He thought about all the mornings that had been available, all the children, all the standing inside the darkness looking out. He thought, I am one of those mornings. This is one of those children, grown. The village had been prepared for them, or prepared for someone, for soldiers moving east, the category of which they were an instance. The church hall had been opened and swept. There were buckets of water near the entrance. A woman of perhaps 60 was standing at the door with the contained, matter-of-fact competence of someone who has decided that what is needed right now is competence and is providing it without being asked, and this, Tomasz thought, was one of the forms courage took that the stories did not always remember to mention. She looked at each man as he entered. Not with pity, he was grateful for the absence of pity, which would have been difficult to receive gracefully in his current state. She looked at them with something more like assessment, the way you look at something you intend to help and are calculating what help is needed and in what order. When Tomasz passed her, she met his eyes for a moment and gave a small nod. That nod, the one he kept receiving from people, the grave and courteous acknowledgement of one person by another, the refusal to look away. He nodded back. Inside, the men dispersed to the walls and the floor with the slow, deliberate movements of people whose bodies had been waiting for permission to stop and were now receiving it and were taking it seriously. Packs came off. Rifles were set carefully against walls. Men sat, and some of them were sitting in the particular way that means the sitting will become lying down very shortly and the lying down will become sleep, and this was entirely correct and right. Tomasz sat his pack down. He stood for a moment in the middle of the hall, in the dusty light coming through the high windows, and took stock of himself in the quiet internal way his father had taught him without teaching him, just by doing it, by example, by the visible practice of a man who checked in with himself regularly and adjusted accordingly. He was tired. He had established this. He was hungry, in a distant, theoretical way that his body had moved past urgency and into acceptance. His feet had opinions. His left shoulder, from the rifle and the pack, had been developing an argument since yesterday afternoon and had now reached the point of formal complaint. But he was here. He had arrived at the place the road had been going toward, and the road had delivered him intact, and the people he had walked with were here, and this was, on balance, an outcome worth acknowledging. He went back outside. He needed air, and he needed to be alone for a moment, which were perhaps the same need. He walked to the northern edge of the village, to the oaks, and stood among them in the middle of the morning. The light came through the canopy in long shafts, moving slightly as the high leaves moved, and the ground under the trees was soft with years of fallen leaves pressed down into a deep, dark mat that gave slightly under his boots and smelled of earth and time. The root systems surfaced here and there above the ground, enormous, deliberate, following their own logic, their own map of where strength was needed. He sat down between two roots, with his back against the trunk of the largest oak, and took off his helmet. The air on his hair and his forehead was cool and immediate and very good. He closed his eyes for a moment and simply felt it, the cool air, the soft ground, the roughness of the bark at his back, the smell of the old wood and the old leaves. He catalogued it with the same careful attention he had been bringing to everything, because these were real things, and present things were what he had. He heard footsteps. Henrik. He knew the footfall by now, lighter than Joseph, quicker than Stashek. With a slight hesitation before committing to terrain that was uncertain, the footfall of a young man who spent more time in lecture halls than in fields and was still, at some level, slightly surprised by ground that was not flat. He came and sat down nearby, Not immediately beside Tomasz, but close enough that the proximity was company without being intrusion. He had his notebook open. He was writing something, the pencil moving in its quick compressed way across the small page. They sat among the oaks in the morning light. After a while Henrik said, without looking up from the notebook, "I've been trying to write what this was." "Has it worked?" Tomasz asked. Henrik stopped writing. He looked at the page, then at the canopy above them, with the expression of someone assessing the distance between what they were trying to do and what they had actually managed. "Partially," he said. "I can write what happened. What the river looked like. What the road felt like in the dark." He paused. "But there's something else. Something underneath all of that I can write around but not directly." He turned the pencil in his fingers. "Do you know what I mean?" Tomasz looked up at the oak canopy, at the light coming through in its shifting shafts, at the leaves beginning their slow turning. "I think," he said slowly, "that you can't write the underneath thing directly because it's not made of words. It's made of he searched for it. It's made of all the ordinary things. The river and the bread and the way Joseph eats his kielbasa. The lamp. The child on the cart." He paused. "The underneath thing is just life. Being alive. How large it is and how small it seems until something makes it large again." Henrik was quiet, considering this. "Write the kielbasa," Tomasz said. "Write the lamp. Write the goose." Henrik looked at him. "What goose?" "Joseph will tell you." Tomasz settled back against the oak. "Ask him to tell you about the goose. Write that down. The underneath thing will be in it." Joseph found them there an hour later. He came through the oaks with his customary quietness, looking no different than he had at any point in the past 2 days, the pack slightly high on the left, the expression steady, the whole of him suggesting a man whose center of gravity was somewhat lower and more settled than ordinary, who was difficult to knock off balance because the balance point was so deep. He sat down without ceremony and looked at the two of them and then looked up at the oaks. "How old do you think these are?" Tomasz asked him. Joseph studied the trunks with the professional attention of a carpenter examining wood. "Old," he said. "Older than anything we've been doing for the past 2 days." "That's what I thought." Oaks like this, he touched the bark of the nearest root, the calloused palm of his hand against the gray ridged surface. "This is 300-400 years of growth. You cannot hurry it. You cannot substitute it. It grows at exactly the speed it grows and no other speed, and the result is this." He looked up at the canopy. "Everything we build, everything I have ever built is made from wood like this. From trees that took this long." Tomasz thought about this. "What does that mean to you?" Joseph considered. "It means that some things are on their own schedule," he said. "And that schedule is longer than we are. And that this is not something to be impatient with." He was quiet for a moment. "It means that the tree doesn't know about this week. And it will not know about next week. And in 100 years it will still not know. And it will be bigger." The light moved through the canopy above them. Tomasz thought about the old man in the square, his son in the church, the grandchildren, the decades between the boy who had stood watching soldiers arrive in 1914 and the old man crossing cobblestones at midnight in 1939, using a stick, with those clear and weathered eyes. All those years inside one life, the way 100 years of growth was inside this trunk, accumulated ring by ring in the dark, building toward something that did not know it was being built toward. He thought about Zosha at the fence, standing her ground in front of the geese, going back every morning, not yet unafraid but refusing to stay away. The school gate. The one look back. He reached into his tunic and took out Marta's letter. He had carried it for 3 days now without reading it in full, drawing instead on the knowledge of it, the weight of it, the fact of it in his pocket. Now he unfolded it in the oak-filtered morning light and read it from the beginning, slowly, as though reading it for the first time, which in some sense he was the man reading it now was not entirely the same man who had first received it, and the same words would find different places in him. her handwriting, careful at the top of the page and hurrying toward the bottom. The details of the plum tree had come in well this year. Burris had been sleeping even more than usual. The neighbor's boy had fixed the fence along the north field and done a reasonable job of it. Then the family news, the small ordinary news of ordinary days, the texture of life continuing in his absence. Then the sentence near the bottom, the one he had been carrying. I am not going to tell you not to be afraid because I think you will be afraid regardless of what I say, and I think that is probably right. But I want you to know that I will be sitting at the kitchen table every evening and the lamp will be on, and when you come back you will be able to see it from the lane.
He read it twice. He folded it and held it.
Then he put it back in his pocket, over his heart, where it had been.
They sat among the oaks for a long time.
The morning moved around them in its slow way, the light shifting as the sun climbed, the shadows of the great trunks moving by degrees across the leaf-soft ground. Somewhere in the village, the sounds of the company settling into the halt voices, the clatter of equipment, someone with a sense of occasion trying a few notes on a mouth organ and then thinking better of it. The ordinary sounds of men in a resting place, taking rest. Tomasz felt the tiredness differently now. Not as a weight anymore, or not only as a weight. More like the tiredness that comes after a long day of genuine work, the kind his father had described once as honest tired, the tired that comes from having used yourself completely for something that needed doing.
He had been used completely. He was honestly tired.
He would sleep tonight, and tomorrow would come, and the road would continue, and he would be on it.
But right now he was here, under these oaks, in this light.
He looked at his hands in his lap, the broad, patient, farmer's hands, his father's hands. They had done things in the past 2 days that he would carry in them for the rest of his life.
He knew this. He did not look away from it.
He held it with the same careful grip he was learning to apply to difficult things, not tight, not loose, but steady,
present, accountable. He breathed.
The ringing in his ears was still there, that thin, high, persistent note that had moved in on the first morning and shown no signs of leaving. He had stopped noticing it again, and now he was noticing it again, and he thought that this was probably how it would be for a while, arriving and departing from consciousness without schedule, like a neighbor who stops by regularly.
He would learn to live with the neighbor.
A leaf fell from the oak above him. Just one, an early one, not yet fully turned, still more green than gold, releasing from its branch with the quiet decision of something that has completed what it came to do. It fell through the shafted light in a slow, tilting spiral, unhurried, taking the path the air gave it, and landed on the dark ground a meter from his boot.
He watched it fall. He watched it land.
He watched it lie still on the old leaves, this one new leaf among all the accumulated ones, adding its small weight to the deep soft mat of everything that had fallen before it and been absorbed and become, over time, the ground itself. He thought, this is what time does with things.
Takes them in, holds them,
makes them, eventually, into the ground the next thing grows from.
He did not know if this was comforting.
He thought it might be true regardless of whether it was comforting, and that truth had its own value independent of comfort.
Joseph was asleep.
He had done it again, simply closed his eyes and gone, with that same complete, unhesitating surrender to sleep that Tomasz had watched in the trench on the first morning, which felt like a long time ago and also like this morning. His helmet was beside him on the ground, and the photograph of Anna and Zosha was visible in the band of it, the two faces looking up at the oak canopy, at the light coming through the turning leaves.
Henrik was still writing
in his small, dense hand, filling the pages of the small notebook, getting it down, the river and the road and the oaks and whatever of the underneath thing he could find in the surface things, which was perhaps all of it, which was perhaps exactly where it lived.
Tomasz leaned his head back against the oak.
He looked up through the canopy at the sky showing through in pieces between the leaves, blue and clear and very far away, and the same sky it had always been, the same sky it would continue to be, patient and enormous and available to everyone who looked up at it from wherever they happened to be standing.
He thought about Marta at the kitchen table. He thought about the lamp.
He let himself see it clearly and completely, the warm yellow of it, the white curtain behind it, the way it made a shape on the lane in the dark, a shape that said here, this place, someone is here and waiting and the light is on. He held the image with everything he had and let it be what it was, which was the future, which was the thing in front of him, which was what fear looked at when it was doing its proper work of knowing what things were worth.
The lamp was on. He would see it from the lane.
He breathed in, slowly, feeling the oak-smelling air fill him, and breathed out, and listened to the village behind him finding its rest, and listened to the oaks above him being what they were, which was old and rooted and entirely indifferent to urgency, which was 400 years of staying.
He was still afraid. He was still tired.
He was still here, under the oaks, in the morning, in the world.
He closed his eyes.
The light moved through the canopy in its slow, shifting way, and the leaf that had fallen lay still on the ground. And Henrik wrote, and Joseph slept, and the oak above Tomasz Wisniewski was exactly as old as it was, and no older and no younger, and was going to continue to grow at the speed it grew and no other speed. And somewhere to the west the road ran back through the town and the fields and the beech wood and the burned buildings and the river and the birch trees.
And somewhere to the east
the road ran on toward whatever it ran toward. And between these two directions he sat with his back against something very old and breathed.
The sky was still the sky.
Dum spiro, spio. While I breathe, I hope. This concludes the story.
Sleep well. Good night.